Thank you, everybody, for joining here, and I'm very excited to see a large mixed group of people, of scientists, of people in the social science, and so on, as far as I know you. My name is Simone Tilmes. I work at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, and my main topic of research was on modeling, SAI, SRM, and looking a lot at impacts and also helping and supporting the degrees community with modeling data. So this topic came about the understanding, from the modeling perspective starting, but then also wanting to know what is the decision-making perspective on what can and can't be learned from SRM modeling. And so this session is really here to start a communication, to increase communication exchange between the physical science and the decision makers. And as we know, there is a lot of things that we really need to have an understanding. And it's very complicated. The modeling, SRM, the impacts, the side effects depend on so many things. And as a scientist, we know there are so many dependencies on how you do SRM, what are the impacts, and what are the outcomes. And that makes it really hard to properly communicate to decision-making from our side. But on the other hand, decision makers have certain expectation and needs to communicate the science to other decision makers, to higher governance. People need to have, certain needs, and maybe these are not really fulfilled in our discussion. So this is really here to start a discussion, to go into the details. And therefore, we put together a panel that consists of experts in the physical science as well as in the decision-making space. And so I want to briefly introduce the panel, and then we go through some questions. And I hope that after sections, we always can engage the audience to also ask questions and speak up and give comments. So this should be an interactive discussion. And so for the panelists, first we have Dr. Katharine Ricke, Associate Professor at the University of Chicago, San Diego. She has been working a long time on SRM modeling. And you will introduce yourself, but you both have experience in SAI as well as marine cloud brightening research and interactions with decision-making. The next person is Dr. Lili Xia, assistant professor, research professor at Rutgers University, and now also the research director, I think, degrees? I don't know the title.
No, it's a staff scientist.
Staff scientist.
Incoming.
Oh, okay. Maybe in the future. I don't know. I'm sorry. Yeah, so a lot. Lili has worked a lot with people in the impact space, but done a lot of modeling in the science of SAI. And the next person here we have Andrew Light, distinguished fellow and professor, former senior U.S. official, now at the University of Chicago and George Mason University, and highly involved in the policy space, worked in the administrations before the current one, and we are very happy to have your perspective here.
Department of Energy in the Biden administration, Department of State in the Obama administration had never wanted to go cross the threshold of either of those places during Trump 1, certainly not.
Right. And we also have... Go ahead. Well, I give everybody a quick chance to introduce themselves. The next person is Cedric Zelu. I hope that's really said right. And he's a dynamic Ghanaian leader in the forefront of climate action. And he currently is the technical director to the Minister of State in charge of climate change sustainability, and he is here replacing Seidu Issifu, who is the Minister of the State. And thank you very much for taking the role and being here with us today, and I hope you can introduce yourself a little more also later. And the last panelist is Portia Williams, and she's a research scientist in Science Technology Policy Research Institute in Ghana, and we had already this morning a great pleasure to have you on the panel, so I leave it with that for now. Thank you. So as an introduction, I already said we want to have the communication, and so we prepared some questions that we start with, and I want to start with something like setting the stage for needs and expectations. So what do people want to learn from SRM modeling, research, and experiments, and in both of the perspectives? So I first want to ask each of you to introduce yourself and say, what have you done so far in the SRM field, and how much did you interact with decision makers or with the physical science and modelers? So we start with Kate and just go down the row.
Sure. Hi. I'm Kate Ricke. I'm a professor at UC San Diego, University of California, San Diego, where I split between Scripps Institution of Oceanography and the School of Global Policy and Strategy, which is our international relations and policy school. So I got started working on SRM during my PhD, and I did sort of two sets of work. One was I did some early climate modeling work where I looked at, my focus was on the regional effects of stratospheric aerosol injection from different levels of SRM, right? So depending on where the global temperature ends up, what's the heterogeneity in regional effects? And so that was part of what I did as a PhD student. And then the other piece was, at the time, there weren't a lot of conversations that had happened so far between physical scientists who were just starting to really seriously think about SRM and people from the international risk governance community. And so as sort of the little like intern type person in the role, I helped organize some early workshops that got international governance people and physical scientists together to start to identify some of the international governance needs related to SRM. Including and particularly focused on research governance. And a lot of the conversations we had back then in 2007, 2009 are the exact same ones we're having today, unfortunately. Since then, I've really worked on becoming sort of an interdisciplinary climate scientist, and that's what I consider myself today. I still run Earth system models, and I still participate in some of these processes thinking about international governance, but I do a lot of more coupled human natural systems modeling that include Earth system models and look at sort of the economic and sort of strategic international implications of those using things like integrated assessment models. And yeah, that's what I do.
Thank you. A lot of SRM background.
A lot of SRM background, yeah.
So my story is still similar. I started let me introduce myself. I'm Lili Xia. I'm an assistant research professor at Rutgers. So same, I started SRM research during my PhD because I read the article on Science about this idea back in 2010, I think. And I was like, wow, that's just such like a scientific fiction story. So I feel that idea is I just want to explore more. So I was trained as a climatologist, so I run climate model and to study SRM. But for me, I feel if this geoengineering is like intentionally trying to cool the planet, then we really need to think about what's the impact for human. So for me, the big part of my research is really look at the impact, including food security, human health, because I think that's when I don't have any experience to talk with decision makers. So I would really trying to learn a lot from this panel discussion. But I do think my impression on the discussion of any of the governance or international negotiation impact for their local community, for their national level impact, that would be their interest. That's just my assumption. I would like to learn more from from the policymakers and also the people study governance or political science. So yeah, I really hope to push the impact study and impact assessment in this field, connecting from the physical scientists to governance. I think there's a big missing part. That's the full impact assessment. So that's what I was trying to do, and I hope that my incoming position, part-time working at DeGrace, trying to facilitate with regional impact assessment, I hope can really help with this towards to that direction. So thank you.
Sorry for jumping the gun earlier. Andrew Light, so for the last 20 or so years, I've been kind of in and out of government in the United States. When the Democrats are in, I've been fortunate enough to be in the government. When the Republicans are in, I'm out as a political appointee by choice, an affiliation. And so, and now just very briefly, so I guess I've worked as a decision maker, as a policy maker, and also a policy advocate. So when in the Obama administration, I worked on for the Special Envoy on Climate Change, who's walking the halls, Todd Stern, and was on the team that was negotiating the Paris Agreement and a bunch of other things. In the Biden administration, I was Assistant Secretary for International Affairs in the Department of Energy, reporting directly to the Secretary, sort of our minister, right, of energy there. And then in the Trump years, the last ones, I was at the World Resources Institute, mostly running U.S., China, India, EU Track 2 dialogues. And then at the end of the Bush administration was at the Center for American Progress, which is a Democratic-oriented think tank. And somewhere along the way, when I was at the Center for American Progress, started getting interested in solar geoengineering, particularly what were the right pathways for some kind of international agreement of some sort, and then had the really good fortune of working with Kate during the last Trump administration on the last National Academies of Sciences report, Reflecting Sunlight, that Chris Field chaired, where I worked mostly, obviously, on the governance side of issues. And I'll say more about it there, but when I've been in office, other than the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration study that was asked for by Congress, which was then done, not a lot was done from this community, any other, to sort of advocate for us on a decision on SRM, because there wasn't really an opportunity where that sort of came up. But that's kind of an interesting context.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cedric. For the past 15 years, I've been the CSO Space and Geospace, where I work with youth groups like the YMCA, the African Youth Commission, across Africa and around the world, in issues about climate change, youth empowerment, advocacy stuff. But what has brought me to this position is that this year, the newly elected President of the Republic of Ghana, His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, appointed for the very first time a Minister for Climate Change and Sustainability, the highest and greatest demonstration of his commitment to face climate change head-on at the highest level. And so the minister is looking for someone to advise or provide technical expertise, looked up to the CSO space, and then I was identified. That's how come I was appointed as the technical director to the Minister for Climate Change and Sustainability. I must confess that this forum is my first, encounter with SRM. And so if the Degrees Initiative would like to, note one of its achievements in terms of this conference, you should know that I'm one of the people, and of course the minister, that it has brought SRM close to, for the very first time. And I'm saying that with all sense of humility, because sometimes policymakers, government officials, sometimes assume certain knowledge, even if they don't have it, just because they are appointed, and because they don't want to be shy, that, oh, you're a minister of state for climate change, and you don't know this. But the truth is, you cannot know everything. You understand? So we are here to learn. The minister will be joining this evening. We are here to learn, essentially to learn about SRM, how we can be able to align the outcome of your research to policy and the realities on the ground. Because the president has a mandate with the people to deliver on certain promises. However, we can also not be blind, to the science, to the research. So how do we marry these together to deliver on our mandate? And it should be known that the minister is a minister of state at the presidency. And so he has the ears of the president to make sure that these research outcomes are integrated at that highest level. So my presence here is to learn from all of you, to borrow ideas, and to see how I can take back to Ghana with the minister and to see how we can deliver on, the research outcomes. Thank you.
All right, thank you, and good morning. Morning, everyone. So my name is Portia Adade Williams. I'm a researcher with the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, also coming from Ghana. And in the SRM space, maybe for research, along this block, maybe I'm the youngest. I've been in the space for barely 2 years, and been in the space due to degrees funding. And so I'm one of the socio-political funded projects, and as at now, the only socio-political funded project in Africa by degrees. And so what is our research trying to do is trying to assess governance and knowledge of SRM in Ghana. The interest is to drive more implications so that we can have more efficient social, political, and ethical outcomes from SRM conversations. And as it's quite new, we are exploring stakeholder perceptions, engagements on SRM, and also trying to kind of deepen understanding around SRM in Ghana, which is quite limited. And with the space of policymakers, though it's still quite new, but then we do have some expected results, and we have, as at now, we are still, data collection is ongoing, but then I would say that our key thing we have done with policymakers is with the stakeholder mapping we have done, just to have an idea of who are the critical stakeholders within the space, what's their interest, what's their influence within the space, and quite interesting, but let me leave it now, and then maybe can pick up more later. Thank you.
Okay, so that's a great introduction, and as you can see, we have people that have a lot of experience on the modeling and the decision maker side with almost a lot or less experience. So I really want to start with the right side of the panel and ask, even if you don't know much about SRM, or you may know more, what is your expectation really on what information and what can you learn from the modeling, from the experiments, and from the research? What do you hope to get out of it? And I think I go backwards again from Portia back to you.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Simone. So, yes, a lot actually to learn. I always say that SRM kind of offers a profound but kind of controversial approach to addressing climate change, and with its uncertain potential risk and benefits. And so people are asking a lot of questions. And once you're a researcher and someone even bumps into you, a policymaker bumps into you, the first question they would want to know, I don't even think it's a first question. There are a number of questions. They don't ask one or two. And so we try to inform decision making. I'm a social science researcher, and so I rely so much on evidence to inform policymakers or decision makers. And so from the modeling studies, I've really been engaging with my colleague climate modelers that what is the implication of the results you have? When you have all those graphs, if you see a typical climate modeling results, it's full of graphs, if I can say maps. You see like 10, 15, and then the question you ask is, what is the implication of this? You are telling us that probably rainfall will increase or rainfall will decrease. But then for me as a social science researcher and to engage more with people, what can I take away from this increasing or decreasing potential trends you are talking about? Coming from a continent where we have over 60% of the population maybe relying on agriculture and majority on rain-fed agriculture, what would be the implication for the smallholder farmer? And if we have more water for the water sector, that is good news because we also need water. We need more water. For the energy sector, maybe for hydro dams, we might need more. Maybe if 2 more, we might have to release dams. That would also cause flooding. So there are a lot of implications. What about cities where there are so many informal settlements? And so what is the message that I should take along? I think that is where working quite closely and collaboratively with climate modelists is very key. And for me, the way forward now is to work together right from the beginning so that we can really understand the details of what the models are bringing out and we can better engage and give out the right information to the key stakeholders who need to take decisions from that. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to the next.
Our expectation is to learn about the potential and limit of SRM. Because from the policy angle, when we say policy, what government think about is the people. When we say policy, what government thinks about is the politics. And so what are the potential and limit of SRM impacting on the people? Because the number one thinking, the mind of every politician is the people and the next government. And so whilst we want to embrace, new ideas, new technologies, invention in SRM, the mind of the government is also on how does this impact the lives of the people and how does it also affect, the next election. So we are keen on learning those limits and potential. I must confess that this is the very first time I've been to a high global level where scientists have been very modest. Very modest in the sense that all those, we heard yesterday from the African session made the point and they introduced if this could happen, things can go worse. If not properly managed, it could bring counter problem. It could bring unintended problem. When you are talking to policymakers and you speak like this, they are excited. They are happy. Because it tells them that you are actually giving them the true reality on the ground of the pros and the cons. The decision is now yours to make, but knowing very well that this could also be an outcome, notwithstanding the intended good. So the policymaker is in full control of the information that you are giving that person. But most often, we get to rooms where the scientists, the researchers, do not present the full scale of the issue. They only present their optimism, the positive, nature of what they've seen, the science. But they sometimes know the negative side, but they tend to shy away from it because they might think that, well, if you say things can go worse, then it means that the politician or the policymaker will not accept it. And so they try to find a backdoor to push these things. The politician signs for it, agrees bilaterally or multilaterally, and then later, things backfire. And the politician looks back to the researcher or the scientist. And, there is so much anger, there's so much pain, and there's so much frustration even, against the scientists and stuff. So we are humble enough to appreciate that those of you who have presented so far have been that generous to us. Presenting your findings, long-term findings, making us aware that these are the positives, but they could be negative. Now, our concern is that we now need full information on both the potential and the limits, so that we can now weigh both ends against our mandate with the people to inform policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So to this question of what would policymakers hope to learn from SRM research, just 2 points. I mean, and this is a much simpler way of putting, I think the great points that were made by my 2 colleagues here, is that clearly if we were considering creating a new national research program in the U.S. of some consequence and longevity, we're going to talk about the next 2 parts of the panel. We'll talk about impacts and uncertainty, and that's obviously would be top of that, as it would be for 1,000 other issues, and mostly looking at risks and costs and benefits, obviously not only with respect to SRM itself, but relative to other climate issues like tipping points, et cetera. Something that goes a little bit beyond the scope of this panel, but I don't think anyone should doubt for a second, is that if I was in some situation in my last job where I had to go to the Secretary of Energy and say there was something that had happened where we need to either seriously consider a research program and engaging in that because there was a need to do so, or someone else in the world had done this, absolutely the conversation would immediately go to the problem of moral hazard. And I know that's sort of beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about, but that would absolutely be on the table, and I'd have to have a good answer to that. Why is that the case? Two reasons. One is that however you want to look at SRM, it's clearly going to be understood in the context of broader obligations that countries have on climate change. And if you had an administration, which you don't have in the United States now, which took climate change seriously, then they'd want to know whether or not engaging on SRM reduced their credibility with respect to their global climate commitments. So they would want to know, how does this impact? And the second thing is that we already know this is true, because once we had an administration like we did in the last administration in the United States that took carbon capture and sequestration seriously and put serious money into it, this was top of the agenda issues that we had to brief up right to our cabinet level officials. One quick example of that, in the Department of Energy, between my office and another office that Holly was part of for a while, Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, we designed a US-China cooperative program on CCS. Pretty elaborate one, pretty ambitious one, as these things kind of go. At one point, John Kerry, who led the climate negotiating side of the House as the special presidential envoy for climate change, Kerry asked me and another colleague for a briefing on this, and we were assured by his team, Secretary Kerry is ready to do this, he wants to jump forward, he has an all-of-the-above strategy, CCS has got to be part of it, and within 10 minutes of the briefing, we immediately started talking about moral hazard and how Kerry was worried that a US-China program would invoke a moral hazard problem with respect to that issue. So again, something maybe we can talk about in Q&A, but don't doubt for a second that will immediately go to the agenda for ministers who have no experience, right, with this issue otherwise.
Yeah, thank you. That is a very important point. We do want to stay on the impact side,
Absolutely.
the uncertainty side in this panel. Moral hazards is certainly the policy implication, and that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for bringing it up, and we can continue discussing it. But coming back, because as a physical scientist, as a modeler, we do want to provide what you're saying. We want to give information, and we have sometimes expectations on what is needed. So this is very useful to hear. I start with Kate and then with Lili to see what you thought about what information you think decision makers would need, and then we can bring it together. But you're welcome to also respond to the previous comments. Kate, do you want to start?
What decision makers would need?
Yeah, what can SRM research provide and useful information to decision makers? And basically, what are their needs or information that you can provide now? And we go later into more details, but more general, what you think, what your expectations are, decision makers would need.
Right. I think this is consistent with what the other panelists have already said, but in my experience, decision makers usually are most concerned about impacts. They want to know about impacts where, in their place for their constituents, where they live. And so translating what we have gotten from, scientific studies into those terms is a very high priority. I mean, in my own experience interacting with decision makers, I guess I would step back a little bit and say that a lot of what they want to know isn't the first stuff they want to know doesn't have anything, we don't need modeling results for it, which is that they just want to understand what SRM is and have you explain it to them. So like the fundamental point that SRM, first of all, there's an observational analog. We have a very good one of like volcanoes for SAI and ship tracks for marine cloud brightening. And why we have some confidence that this cooling is possible based on those things. And then second of all, this really fundamental point that geophysically speaking, and we just know this from basic physics, we don't need modeling results, that geophysically SRM is the only way to cool the climate quickly on, like, I don't have to say on political timescales because they understand that, as opposed to mitigation, which just in order to get the sort of cooling and impacts reduction effects, it takes a lot longer than, 1 to 2 years. And so explaining those basic facts is usually the first priority. And then there's the impact stuff, and then I'm going to come back to that in a minute because it's really complicated. And then the other is like responding to something that happened in the news that put this on their radar and on their constituents' radar. Like, so for example, in California, I got called onto a Zoom with staffers for a local congressperson, like a U.S. congressperson, when there was this experiment in Alameda. They wanted to understand, they wanted me to walk them through, like, what the heck is marine cloud brightening? How is it different than the cloud seeding stuff I've heard of before? What are the dangers to the community? What should we be doing actually, I think this was in the California legislature. How should we respond to this? And I can't answer that question, but like just very basic science. And not stuff coming from the modeling results. Now when it gets to the impacts, and I think Lili's better to explain this, like the really complicated piece there is to try and explain effectively how uncertain results are when we try to translate things into impacts. And a lot of that stems from the fact that hydrological variables and things like water availability, we just don't have a lot of confidence in what's coming out of climate models, and we need those projections in order to make credible impacts projections. And maybe I'll let Lili take it from there, but I think that's really one of the big things that I've contended with that's difficult when talking to decision makers about the science.
Well, yeah, I mean, since I haven't really talked with any of the decision makers, I don't have that kind of experience, but I totally agree with Katie. So like the cooling effect, probably we even don't need modeling. But when it's going to really impact, I had long time experience working on crop models and looking at agricultural production change and food security. So that's a very complicated situation. It requires the rainfall, requires sunlight and also temperature, and also there's agricultural practice there involved. So when you are doing the modeling there, I just want also go back to the question Cedric mentioned. When we presented to any of the policymakers, we need to present the full scale. But for impact, it's really complicated if you really trying to present the full scale. You're probably going to positive 100 to negative 100. It's based on your scenario, based on your assumption, and how you deal with this problem. So that's also my question there. I do think we need to trying to translate what the climate model tells us about temperature or general global average precipitation to the impact, more specifically, for example, agricultural or human health, something like that. Then how are we going to really bring all those impact to the policymaker? That's like a big question for me. I don't have that kind of experience. Whenever I talk about impact, people always say, oh, the uncertainty is too large. We cannot really communicate with this huge uncertainty. How are we going to communicate that? I also would like to hear back from other panelists on that suggestion. How are we going to communicate uncertainty? Probably our third question there. Yeah.
Can I just say one more thing? So just, I know we got a little discouraged from speaking about this, but just speaking quickly to this moral hazard piece that Andrew brought up. I think one thing, if I were to give a piece of advice to scientists, is like, scientists really need to fully internalize the legitimacy of this concern that people have about moral hazard. because this is something that intersects with how we get entrained into conversations with policymakers and decision makers, because often policymakers and decision makers will get activated by activists, environmental activists, and a lot of activists, their positions, in my experience, are motivated by the moral hazard concern, even if they're bringing in other arguments like the potential for local environmental harms from experiments or something. And so if we don't come to the conversation that we're bringing to educate people about the science with like acknowledgement of that legitimate concern, then immediately there's this conflict that's going to emerge, because often people are convinced by that. Intuitively, it makes sense. And so you can't avoid it when you're...
And maybe you're outlining quickly the moral hazard. I'm not sure if everybody in this room knows.
I'm so sorry. This is the idea. It's called moral hazard because there's a sort of analog with economics of risk associated with things like insurance and seatbelts and things like this. The idea is that people recalibrate their risk preferences incorrectly when some new risk mitigation tool emerges. And so in the context of solar geoengineering, now it's often called mitigation deterrence. And the idea is that as people learn about SRM and like really buy into it as a possibility for something we could do in response to climate change, it will reduce the sort of momentum towards rapidly reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Right. Yeah, and so just to follow up quickly, because I think this is an important point that people really understand. Scientists and many people here know that SRM research is here to understand what are the impacts, the benefits, the risks, and the moral hazard in the political sense, saying we may deter our efforts on climate change is not what is intended. In contrast, because the research can also lead us to the understanding this cannot be a plan B, but in contrast, it may not actually work out. And we need to continue mitigating, because having an opportunity for something doesn't mean that it can actually be applied. And that's an important thing, I think, that comes out of research, and that should be brought up in this context. So it is an important point. We don't need to just say when ignoring the topic. But coming back to our questions on what do we want to learn from the scientists, what do we expect to give, I think there's a lot of overlap. I think we understand each other in saying, yes, I want to know what happens to the people. I want to know what happens to the ground. I need to inform the population. I need to inform the decision makers to understand it. And where you're coming from is like, how can I do this? How can I actually provide those information for my global model? This is all so complicated. And I think that's something where we need to find the common ground. How do we find the interface here and get this information in the right way? And I think we talk about it a little bit more when we start talking about what are like the impacts and how can we respond as examples for a conversation, because there are so many conversations we can have. Before we continue on that part, I wonder if anybody in the audience want to chime in with a comment or two. We don't want to do too much, maybe a couple comments. Since you're starting, I hand the mic to you.
Hi, Mark from SRM 360. I'm just wondering a couple of things. When you talk about the impacts with policymakers, how much do you start with, this is the impact of climate change that we think, now this is what SRM might do to reduce that impact of climate change, and then now, but here are the uncertainties and the risks, because I would love to be able to do that, let's say on a website, for Brazilians can now look, okay, this is what climate change does to your agriculture, does to your water, does to your security, does to your health. This is how SRM, how close are we to be able to present it like that? Because, and I guess just the follow-up is, the uncertainty you speak about in the impacts of SRM, I mean, it's using the same models, right, as the impacts of climate change in general. Why can you be more certain about the impacts of climate change on water, health, security, whatever it might be, but you're less certain on the impacts of SRM. I'm not sure I fully understand why that's the case. Thank you.
I can help.
Thanks, please.
Yeah, I can help answer that question a little bit. So first I want to see what you mentioned. Yes, when we look at the model output or impact model output, we do compare the SRM with the global warming, depends on which global warming pathway you are simulating in your model. And your second question, the uncertainty. Yes, global warming, the impact studies, they still have really large uncertainty there. Actually, if you look at the agriculture modeling, the uncertainty from agriculture modeling simulating how the global warming will change production, that's larger than the uncertainty from climate models. So the crop model itself has larger uncertainty than climate model in terms of simulating temperature or precipitation. So that's one thing. Another thing is the impact model currently we're using, they are designed to really study global warming. So that's another thing. It's not really designed to study there's a cooling but still maintain the high CO2 in the atmosphere. So the model has probably missing some fundamental functions there to really understand how SRM going to impact agriculture or human health or something like that. So that's like just my 2 cents.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to comment? No. Okay, so there were a couple more questions, then we move on. And I think you were first, and then... Okay. You start then.
It's okay? Okay. Thank you. I have a question to Kate. So I think you were working on economic damages of climate change as well, and like social carbon. I was wondering about, like, my sense is policymakers quite interested in understand the economic impacts of climate change as well as SRM as well. So do you think is it possible or feasible from modeller's perspective to estimating economic damages or benefits of SRM? Is it workable for the models, or is it also, do you think, is it important information can provide for more effective policy making? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, before you answer, I think we are going into the second question, and maybe we address it right away while we go and answer, because it's really what can we learn in terms of impacts, and also then in part of how can this translate to decision making. So if we want to lead into the second question on that as well, and then we continue with the panel.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that because I've worked on economic impacts of climate change without SRM, and then I've tried to, use the same models to also look at impacts with SRM. Tony Harding, who's in this room, and I wrote a paper on this a few years ago. So the models that project the economic impacts of climate change are extremely uncertain, right? And this is such an active area of research, and a very contentious one as well, with a lot of nastiness and arguments among the researchers, maybe partially because that's how economists are, but sorry, I like economists, a lot of economists. Anyway, especially you, Tony. So everything we do with the effects of SRM then on the economy have to be taken in that context of that very high uncertainty. And I don't think that means we shouldn't do it. We absolutely should. I'll just give the example of what we took away with our paper. One was that, these models that are considered the state of the art right now at projecting the economic impacts of global warming tell us that the economic impacts would be drastically reduced by applying stratospheric aerosol cooling. And if you want to go even further, like with the economic impacts of cooling the planet beyond where it was before would be even better, you know. But I would say, like, at the end of that paper, one of our conclusions was a lot of what we've put together here should be evidence of how suspicious we should be of these models, actually. And so, you know, again, we should do it, but, you know, you got to take these results with a grain of salt. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. And I think since we are at that topic, I think I do want to go through and ask the panels to, especially Lili and Kate, on not only the economic impacts, but really the impacts on SRM also from the modeling. What you think is the most robust thing you can learn from models? What is the least robust thing you can actually learn from models? And afterwards, I will go to Andrew, Portia, and Cedric to also ask what is the relevance for those information that you're just hearing for your impact. And then we'll go back to the questions. I do want to work on this first so we get the basic knowledge that we want to bring to you first.
Okay, I guess I'll go first, even though I feel like I'm talking too much. Okay, so I would say, okay, we all know how important water is. Like, intuitively, we know how important water and water availability is. And unfortunately, like, the robustness from the models isn't that great, in my opinion, when it comes to a lot of important hydrological variables. But that said, what I think is very robust is, like, that there are major temperature reductions potentially depending on how you do SRM. And I will say from, like, the climate econometric literature, a lot of what's considered the best empirically based climate impacts research, the indicator that we see based on historical data as being most important to impacts is temperature. Like, temperature is important, and our indication of how SRM influences surface temperature is pretty robust. I'll leave it at that because Lili's the impacts modeler.
No, I agree, Katie. Like, yeah, most robust, that will be temperature. And even if you ask about impact for agriculture, then something we're sure is if you reduce the temperature, if you have the cooling, then agriculture crops will respond to this cooling, probably will be the strongest response to SRM. And even there's a large uncertainty on impact models, but just based on the temperature, we can probably say, based on Brandon's paper, so it's over the high latitude region, they probably don't like geoengineering that much because they enjoy global warming to have higher temperature, good for their agricultural production, like in Russia. But in, like, tropical region or mid-latitude region, maybe they don't like they will appreciate the cooling effect from SRM. So even without really detailed modeling, just like Kit said, for climate models, maybe we can get this general conclusion for agriculture as well. But if you really want to look at regional different impacts, then, like, the precipitation rainfall will be extremely important, especially for Africa. Maybe they don't care much about the temperature for their agricultural production, but they care about precipitation. Majority of the land here is rain-fed. There's no irrigation. So the precipitation dry season and wet season, this switch will make a significant difference for their local production, agricultural production, and then will change their food availability and food security. So I would say, yeah, temperature probably the most robust, but when it's going to hydrology parameters or rainfall and even goes to other output, that will have the really large uncertainty. And even for human health, if we talk about sulfate aerosol injection, if we are projection in the future, in total, you can assume, yeah, people will worry we put aerosol there, then what about the air pollution on human health? But if we're considering the air clean in the troposphere, then in total, it's probably okay. But you still need to look at the regional, local impact, because it might change where the aerosol deposited. So it might have different impact on different nations. Those are something we are not sure and really need some effort to look at.
Yeah, so no. It would be great to know, how do you feel about these answers? What do you think? Can you do with knowing temperature may be robust, other things we can really not say much about. Economical models are very uncertain. What do decision makers do with this information? What do they want to know?
I think their first answers would actually reflect something Cedric said earlier. Or their first questions would reflect something Cedric said earlier, would not be that granular, but would want to know as much as we could, as the conversation continued, how granular we could go on particular sectors and regional differences, right? So let's say various scenarios. Could be a so-called rogue deployment happens, a coalition of countries come together and they decide to do a joint research program that the U.S. Either is asked to join or is not asked to join. It could be a proposal in the G20 for a moratorium, right, or something, or a non-use agreement or something like that. In all those cases, there would be, and this is not a prioritized order, two questions that I would have to be able to answer and that immediately the White House would demand an answer on from a variety of agencies. Is number one, what would be the probable impacts to the United States, as much as you can tell, region by region? Number two, what would be the impacts of whatever would happen, either taking SRM off the table or moving towards doing it in the rest of the world? And almost immediately, this becomes a political question, which is informed by science and not decided by science. Because what Cedric said is absolutely right, especially in democracies. Decision makers are politicians or appointed by politicians, and they have to respond to their constituencies. So on the question of what would be the impacts domestically in the U.S. or some other country, immediately you're going to have to look at how do you balance the potential impacts of one constituency versus another. Farmers versus, in arid lands versus farmers not in arid lands, or, farmers versus, right, cities that have water scarcity problems, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the kind of conversation that would happen. And then I think as anyone in here who's worked on this for not very long would already can see, is that internationally the question would become one that's really overshadowed by geopolitics. What's going to happen to the countries that are close to us? What's going to happen to the countries that we have some kind of border dispute with or something like that, right? The second thing that I think is kind of interesting on this, and I'm thinking about this particularly in the context of proposals for Arctic deployment, which for various reasons I'm happy to talk offline on people, I would put fairly high on probability for the first kind of deployment, if deployment ever happens, might happen, would be, can you geographically constrain, right, some kind of intervention, such as in an Arctic deployment, so that you're actually reducing the array of probabilities and risks that you're having to look at versus those two questions that I said they would want answers on immediately. Because I think there you go from a global intervention versus the impacts of climate change to potentially some other kind of intervention with respect to emergency response to, a crisis that's occurring in those places. So I think that's how the framing would go with respect to impacts.
I think that the information coming from the research scientists is very, very useful. And if I should leave this meeting and to brief the minister, I think if I want to capture SRM just in brief, what I'm going to tell him is that SRM is predictive in this way or is not predictive in this way. Then the minister will ask me, so Cedric, what does that mean? What does it mean to government? What does it mean? So it means three things. Where it is predictive, we want to move on. But then essentially, we'll be concerned with where SRM is not predictive. Then we are now looking at areas of risk assessment. That if it is not predictive in this area, how do we address these risks on agriculture, on rainfall patterns, on floods, on drought. That is where it is not predictive. So it's going to inform governments' analysis of risk assessment, number one. Number two, it will then dive into the issues of climate adaptation, the strategies that the government will now need to put in place to adapt, especially to the unpredictability of SRM. Then final phase is that we are going to move to a point where we've all agreed that this is a virgin space in terms of global governance, that there's no global architecture governing this space. What that means to the minister is that you are going to meet, folks from the United States, from Great Britain, from China, from everywhere, to now discuss about the global governance. So it is this information coming from the scientists about the predictability of SRM or not that will now inform what kind of multilateral and global arrangement, negotiations that will go on at that highest level to come up with an architecture to govern the space. Because like I said, it is true. Whilst you're looking at your own country, you need to look at the impact of what other regions also. And that is going to give some, give and take, because we are not all going to benefit the same way, even if SRM is deployed. And so governments from the south will be concerned about what kind of stakes would they put on negotiation to be able to come to a collective agreement on the architecture in this process. So it is one about risk assessment, about climate strategies for adaptation, then also to enhance multilateral and global cooperation in terms of its governance.
Yeah, I think after listening to the fellow panelists, I don't know what to even add on now, because they've kind of said it all. I think it's very important. Maybe what gets a bit worrying is knowing how critical rainfall is within vulnerable contexts like Africa, for instance, and knowing that that's where we have the highest uncertainty. I think that makes it a bit concerning, in a way that, as I said earlier, we have majority of the economies relying on agriculture and on rain-fed agriculture. And so it's so critical for production activities. And so if, for instance, a model output saying that across the Sahel, applying SRM could, and I'm saying could, reduce rainfall by 30%. And how would you then stand to engage maybe a smallholder farmer or even a politician who is very curious to know what happens? And I think we've said it over, I think, in this meeting, that not knowing is even the danger. And so once we know that, then what do we really put in place? How does it affect our adaptation efforts? And so be it positive or negative, I think it is better knowing and better driving our adaptation efforts quite well. And I think that's what I would like to add to all that they've said. I agree perfectly with that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this is a very good point to say, what do we do with the uncertainty that you brought up in that context? And I think now there are several hands, and anybody can start commenting on this. Let's start the broader discussion. And I think you were the first now, so I give you... Oh, I guess my vision isn't... You were still with you then.
Thank you very much. So, John Moore from University of Lapland. I think that the discussion has been very great, but the point of the larger impacts tends to be these extreme events, which are not very well captured by models at low resolution and for relatively short duration runs. And I think it's certainly the case, like I know much more about agriculture in China, that there's a lot of human choice about what is grown, what seeds are done, and maybe that's a different context in Africa. So there can be important regional differences, even given the same amount of damage done in different countries. But do you have some comments about that, please? Oh, sorry.
It was you, and then...
I'm not sure I understood the question, John.
I'm saying that that different countries have different human responses to, or the limits of adaptation can be very different in different places, so that you will have far bigger impacts conceivably in some countries than in other countries, just simply because of the government response to it.
Yeah, I mean, you are speaking to a concept that is well captured as common but differentiated impact. And so let me take this room, for example. If, let's say, this place is flooded, imagine that this is your country. Would have gotten to this place, with different means. Some would have come with a bicycle, some would have walked here, public transport, flight, or car. So it is flooded, but we are not impacted the same way. Some people can still get back home because of the means that they came with. Some cannot even go home at all. Some will have just maybe their shoe wet, but some will have their laptops completely destroyed, while some never came here with a laptop. So the same rainfall, the same flood, but we are all affected differently. Now, how to recover from this impact is what he's talking about. And for us in the South, the main issue about recovery is about capacity, the technology, and ultimately the financing. So if you bring that into the context of SRM, if things go south, if things doesn't work well, what that even means is that advanced countries would have more capacity to come out, resilient from the impact of what? SRM, than countries like in Africa, because we would be lacking the capacity, the financing, and even the technology to recover from that. And that is a reality. It's a reality everywhere. Even in the same country, for instance, even in America, it's the same reality. Because folks in Florida don't have the same capacity, let's say, against or with folks in North Florida, in New York or Pennsylvania. But the case of Africa is very serious. And I think that this is a very important point that you have raised. And so for us, the policymakers, one thing that we'd want to discuss further with the scientists is that given the ease, given the unpredictability of this, what capacity or what level of readiness should we be developing alongside the measures to deploy this, so that we don't wait for things to go bad before we say, Jack, we're in this situation. So help us come along. And once you develop, let your modeling also reflect our reality, that if things go bad, then have these standby capacity, standby resource technologies in place to deal with, what she's talking about in terms of rainfall. Because for my country, people heavily depend on rainfall. They actually pray for rain to come down. So even though we are working on adaptation, this is a reality. So if 40%, SRM is going to impact, rainfall pattern of 40%, you can imagine, the percentage of people who will be cut off from basic necessity or livelihood. They're not even thinking about, growing to export. They are talking about just growing to feed themselves. And if people are just going to feed themselves and their family, are going to be impacted 40% by SRM, then you can imagine the situation in which you have. And so capacity, development is very important.
Just to also bring, maybe in terms of context, as you talked about China, I think I would refer to, so when I'm speaking, I'm also very cautious to talk about decision making, and not only for policymakers, because from the last IPCC assessment for Africa, when you look at adaptation efforts and who are taking the lead, it's individuals. And so probably in the context of China, where maybe what to grow and all that might depend on maybe how much government effort is put in. Within our context, and from the last assessments, much efforts is at the individual level. So what individual farmer is able to do and is able to grow. And so it makes the farmer a critical decision maker here. And so it's very important not to overlook maybe that brings a bit of difference in the efforts. As much as governments are putting in efforts within this context, it's more driven by maybe individual level. Thank you.
I may go to the next question, or is that okay?
I'll just say something really quickly, which is that, I mean, a lot of this might be like a matter of making sure, well, first of all, I think it says something about how important it is to grow the research community that's what's working on and thinking about SRM. I mean, there's a ton of work to draw on upon here when answering the type of question that you just asked, because like development economists have been working on this question for decades, and they've been like conducting RCTs. They have very good empirical information, and they're already thinking about this in terms of strategizing for like adaptation to the climate change that people are already thinking about, and figuring out how to deploy resources and think about uncertainty and strategies. And so I think that part of this might be a matter of like making sure that we're integrating the right information into the interpretation of this new science, because there is already a lot to draw on. So that's...
No, that's great. So you had it a long time, and then Brendan also, I'm sorry.
Hi, my name is Ignacio Mastroleo. I'm from Argentina, a degrees researcher, and I have a background in philosophy. One question about modeling that interests me a lot is about single interventions, SRM, versus multiple interventions. So I understand that when we are talking about SRM, we are mostly talking about single interventions, SIA or MCB or something like that. But when you're I'm put my hat like I'm a policymaker, or I'm a person like combining in uncertainty, communicating uncertainty to a policymaker. I have to tell them, look, these models, they are based on one single intervention, let's say mostly, or except a couple of papers. But deployment won't be a single intervention. It will be a combination of technologies that we don't know, we cannot predict how it would be. But that happened to you. What's your stance at that single, multiple interventions limit?
Are you more interested in like the scientific answer to that, or the policy answer to that?
The scientific policy, I don't know.
I mean, this is something that is relevant to like my research program right now. I agree with you. I think, you know, if I had to like come up with my subjective probabilities, it's much more likely that SRM will be deployed in like a small way at first, like testing boundaries to see what happens, and then it's possible that, you know, we'll end up in a world where we're experiencing the effects of like various cobbled together schemes. And I think that's especially true for marine cloud brightening, right? And there's some good evidence empirically that even though people are more skeptical of the science of MCB than SAI in some ways, I think, you know, MCB is more like feasible from like both geopolitical and socio-technical standpoint. And I think the problem with the science is that we're not there yet. Like, it takes time to build up the information about individually what the results of interventions are, the physical mechanisms behind that, and then like starting to, like, the degrees of freedom are massive when you start talking about SRM scenarios, and you know, it's still just step by step, and so I mean, people are aware of what you're talking about. It's just,
but
as scientists, we have to step through.
But my question is, politicians are aware that the levels of risk that models predict are based on single interventions and not on multiple interventions. So the real scenario would be mostly multiple interventions. No matter what. Like,
may I just build on that question? I won't answer that, but that's I have another question just based on that. So if we communicate to policymakers this option, like the multiple interventions, if they know if we design the scenarios, we can change the impact in their own country, what does that mean to each nation? Are they going to willing to really trying to investigate and trying to design a scenario benefit their own country or their allies? I don't know.
Yeah. Another Brendan. Brendan is next. Yeah, you take this one.
Passing the mic.
Yeah, that's great. And we have that. It
All
has
right.
to be the last
I'll wrap
question.
it up. Okay.
Yeah.
So can say anything again. Okay, I'll make it good. I want to go back to the title of this little breakout.
That's great.
So. Did you have a question, Dan?
Just go ahead we see what
Okay.
the time is.
So going back, what can and can't we learn from SRM modeling? In terms of plants and agriculture, which is what I work on, there was discussion about regional uncertainties, which is certainly true, like things like extreme events and what kind of crop you plant and when you plant it. But I would say that even at a global scale, there's still huge uncertainties. There was one study that looked at Pinatubo, and it found that the negative impact from radiation, decreasing direct radiation, was just as big as the benefit you get from cooling on global agriculture. The models don't say that at all. The models say you only get a benefit from temperature. There's no radiation impact. There's other things. You're decreasing temperatures, but you're keeping CO2 high. That's a super novel climate state that we don't know. There's no research, outdoor research about that. So I'm saying at one point, can we not learn anything else from models, and we have to go out to greenhouses and outdoor experiments, try to mimic SAI in the real world and go beyond models? When do we start doing that? Because no one's done that yet.
Yeah, that's a good point. I do give, okay, Dan has a word, and then I think we really wrap up. You wanted to?
Yeah, I know there are a lot of modelers on this panel, some policy folks too, and I'm just curious, Kate, Lili, yeah. Well, so uncertainty has been talked about by everyone, and Kate mentioned this. But it's really true that the models are not capable of giving policymakers the information that they want, except maybe in the crudest way. Kate, would you say that, for example, other than saying that SRM probably in most cases diminishes the impacts of climate change to some extent? That's our best guess from all of the modeling work we've seen. But anything more specific than that is probably not terribly reliable at any regional or smaller scale. To me, I'm always interested in the things where it doesn't work. Like, for example, you mentioned the higher CO2 effect on plants. It's probably a water use efficiency interesting effect where it doesn't reverse the impacts of climate change because of the higher CO2. Those are the things that I think are most interesting, but the models aren't capable of really giving you reliable predictions of humidity. So what are we talking about here? In some ways, all we can tell policymakers is SRM is, based on what we know, likely to reduce. Other than that, we have to talk about specific deployment scenarios. Where do you put the aerosols? At what altitude? All of those things matter probably. And that's all in the noise within the models, don't you think?
I mean, maybe I can answer it first, because I think it isn't actually in the noise. I think where you put the aerosols, it matters a lot. How you apply, it matters a lot, and we already know this. We have learned a lot from modeling and what is a bad idea, for example, and that's really important. The modeling can give you those answers. If we actually cross out the things that aren't good ideas, that's a really good step for policymakers and for decision makers to know. Maybe one country alone in the Northern Hemisphere shouldn't start this because it will have devastating effects. We already know this, and I think that's a really important part where you can go. There are other things we have learned from models that are bad ideas. And for example, it starts with uncertainties on marine cloud lightning. Kate studied just the PhD student did really interesting work on seeing that marine cloud brightening may work in present day, but it may do the opposite in the future. This is where modeling can really help us. But what we still can do with models, we're not always staying in the noise. I think the research we are doing can go into more information. I mean, we still can go and become more knowledgeable and in reducing uncertainties. First, we need to understand the uncertainties, but we can also reduce them. And I can let you answer, but I know if you want.
From the policy side?
Yes, I want to give a last answer exactly to the policy side, and then we finish the panel. And thank you all.
Thanks, and thanks for the question, Dan, on that. So whether you're right or Simone is right or closer to right on this, it gets to an issue that you teed up that we didn't get to, which is the whole question of uncertainty and that. And like that's the next question. So if this is what the science tells you now, how confident are you on the risk, cost, benefits answers? And I would say low if I was you, right, in terms of the granularity I was talking about earlier, maybe slightly higher if I was Simone. Whatever. If we're designing a research program, then the next question becomes, okay, well, how can we strengthen that? Would some number of smaller outdoor experiments strengthen that or not? And then we'd have to get answers to that we would feed up to a decision-making authority to do that. And so that's kind of number one. And number two, I'd sort of say, this is not at all a unique issue with respect to SRM or any other climate intervention. Quite unexpectedly, a big part of my job, in fact, a second job on top of my first job in the last administration, was figuring out how to fight an energy war on several fronts with Russia. And it started in Ukraine, it spread to Europe, it became global on oil. With respect to Ukraine, fortunately, and actually surprisingly, once Russia started terror bombing Ukraine's electricity grid, we immediately had to figure out how do we best aid Ukraine to make sure their grid doesn't collapse so that large parts of the country become uninhabitable. And we knew some things, but we didn't know all things. And so immediately the question was, what resources do you need? Who do you need to go to in the national lab system and others in order to strengthen the confidence you can give on where we should rack and stack our priorities of what equipment to help them to put where and what to basically put on, in the back lines in order to deploy. So this is not an unusual situation where you have a lot of uncertainty in an emergency situation. Governments actually kind of do this fairly well in some cases and not well in the others. There's ways to strengthen that. So I think that there are immediate questions which would probably get to some things which are the bread and butter of groups like these.
Thank you.
Yeah. It is true that, single modeling versus multiple modeling is a big issue, and government would always look at issues about multiple modeling. Because, for instance, if you say that SRM affects rainfall patterns by 40%, what does it mean to say Kenya? What does it mean to say Ghana? What does it mean to Ghana when we say that Ghana has a population that is 60% dependent on agriculture? So we're talking about the 40% impacting the 60% of our population. But your model to look at the 40% of SRM impact on rainfall. But that 40% is what is going to affect, let's say, every country. But it is going to affect 60% of our population. Other population will be affected only by 2%. So we will be concerned about issues about the multiple modeling, that this is the extent to which the 40% affect us. Then the politician is going to ask the question that if 60% of our people who are into agriculture are going to be affected by 40%, what does that mean? It means that 60% of our people are going to be out of job. What does that mean? It means that there will be conflict. They will rise up in arms. It means the government will lose power. So the multiple modeling is truly an essential, or critical issue to discuss. And here, once again, it's a matter for the scientists, the researchers to engage in. And if you ask me, I would say that government investors should be interested in investing in such, multiple modeling, because I know that the research is very, very expensive. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think if nobody wants to react, we are out of time, and I think we reached the goal. We started the discussion, and that is really exciting because I see a lot of people have questions and a lot of really good comments, and I hope that we continue this going to lunch and enjoy it, and thank you so much for all of you, especially the panel members. Thanks.